This is our book club webinar that we've opened up for this special occasion on this topic, with Elizabeth joining me. And the Blue Marble evaluation book is what we've been looking at. The blue marble refers to the iconic image of the whole Earth from space, and it's about thinking holistically across boundaries, across categories, from local to global scales. And of course, we're living in the midst of that phenomenon with the coronavirus and COVID-19. A colleague today sent me a cartoon from the New Yorker illustrating some of what this is about. This shows the moon keeping distance from the Earth, and another illustration honoring the many health workers and first responders who are working to flatten the curve even as we speak. We all have our contributions to make at this critical time. Evaluators, philosophers, those of you providing services, we're all in this together, and that is part of our context for engaging and thinking about these things. Part of what Elizabeth's work has been about, and one of the reasons why I was anxious to have her join us, is that we're especially in danger of stopping thinking in times of crisis. And thinking can be more important, or as important as ever at such times. And that's what we're going to do. The Blue Marble evaluation book is a set of principles, the first one of which is a global thinking principle that we dealt with in Chapter 1. The global thinking principle is to apply whole Earth, big picture thinking to all aspects of systems change, and that's certainly what we face with the coronavirus. From an evaluation perspective, that means to think globally, people are acting locally, and we evaluate those interactions. Our larger context is that the pandemic health emergency is part of a larger global climate emergency. We are the first generation to know that we are destroying the planet, and the last generation that can do anything about it. And so that larger emergency remains very much prescient and a part of our world. The Secretary General of the United Nations has been urging people not to forget that larger context, even as we face the immediate moment. And so the challenges of our Earth, our use of resources, are quite visceral at this moment, which brings us to Chapter 2 in the book, which was about the Anthropocene, the period in which humans are having more impact on the world than our natural resources. A very important paper in Ecology and Society talked about the concept of the Anthropocene as a game changer, a new context for social innovation and transformations to sustainability. That requires a very different world system in all levels. So our third principle, the one that is the theme of today, is the transformative engagement principle. It opens with this quote from Stanislav Grof, a Czechoslovakian psychiatrist, who said, in the kind of world we have today, transformation of humanity might well be our only real hope for survival. There are a number of transformation conferences, work going on around the world that I became a part of and became more aware of. An example of this is from Million Belay, a coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, a broad alliance of different civil society actors that are advocating and working towards food sovereignty and agroecology in Africa. I met Million at a transformation conference 2 years ago, and he wrote a blog after that conference in which he said, "I globetrot from one meeting to another. Some of us are caught up in this cycle, and there seems to be no way out of it. Anyway, this year," he was talking 2017, "I participated in 9 international meetings. I was active in all of them, either as part of the organizing group or as a presenter. There is one thread connecting all of them: transformation." And so in essence, we have 2 conclusions that inform the widespread calls for global systems transformation. Humanity's use of Earth's resources for both production and consumption is unsustainable, and transformation globally is urgently required to avoid catastrophe for humanity. The Anthropocene principle is to know and face the realities of the Anthropocene, and to begin taking transformation seriously then as a response to moving into the Anthropocene. The transformation engagement principle in the book is to engage and evaluate consistent with the magnitude, direction, and speed of transportations needed and envisioned. That principle and the other principles in the book are subject to evaluation. And principles-focused evaluation directs us to evaluate these principles on the extent to which they are meaningful, which is what we're going to look at today. What does transformation mean? Where are they adhered to? Are we following the principle of working toward transformation? And what would the results of transformation look like? And so to help me and all of us think through this and to bring evaluation into the picture of transformation, I'm inviting today, and I'm delighted that she accepted the invitation, the co-editor and co-author with me of a book we just brought out last year called Thought Work, Thinking, Action, and the Fate of the World. Elizabeth Minnich is a longtime colleague. We're going to talk about the origins of this book in her previous work on working with Hannah Arendt on her work around the Holocaust, where the phrase "the banality of evil" emerged. And Elizabeth, a couple of years ago, came out with a new book updating that work called The Evil of Banality, which we'll look at, subtitled The Life and Death Importance of Thinking, which includes a section on the banality of good, which quite caught my attention because a lot of evaluation is done in a banal way. And we'll return to these themes. But what I wanted to begin with Elizabeth was an earlier book that she wrote, first edition of which came out in 1990, and the second edition came out in 1992. So this is some 30 years ago. Elizabeth was thinking about and writing about transformation. And I want to have her talk with us about how she came to that term, what she's seen around it, what she means by it, as a philosopher, as someone who's an activist, not just thinking about things, but engaged in the world. And I thought I would set the context for this by reading the introduction to this book, where Elizabeth talks about what she does as fieldwork philosophizing, as philosophical fieldwork. And she says that during her years of work on transforming courses and curriculum to make them adequately inclusive, work that she took up after her initial discovery of the revelatory power of thinking about women, she wasn't initially sure that she was using a method, but came to view what she was doing as fieldwork philosophizing. And what this involves is thinking that is stung awake by encounters with people whose certainties appear untroubled by questions about the meanings that inform their knowledge and their actions as philosophical. She goes on and writes, "I remember and still love Socrates, who reminds us of the gadfly effect of thinkers, of the need for intellectual midwifery to discover whether our ideas are babies or only wind eggs. He also said that thinking is like a wind that blows everything down. We honor Socrates now. Athens put him to death for corrupting its youth. It is helpful to remember that, as long as one recognizes that being charged with corrupting anyone is always a call to the most serious self-examination and no means proof that one is Socrates." She goes on to say about fieldwork philosophizing, making sense with one another, which is what we're doing today, making sense with one another, which is both enabled and limited by culturally framed interactions, is an ongoing project that can never be completed. It is a transactional process that has no products but does have crucial effects, and those effects are of great importance. Through them, we can be deformed as well as informed, and sometimes even transformed. And sometimes even transformed. Thank you for joining us, Elizabeth. And let me ask you, as you chose this title some 30 years ago, before the language of transformation had reached its current state of urgency across systems, Elizabeth is coming to us from North Carolina. What did you mean by transformation? Where do you think we are today on knowledge transformational trajectory you envisioned 3 decades ago? How do you think about this term in today's world? Help us think about the meaning of transformation as you've worked on it deeply over these many decades. Welcome to the webinar, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you for including philosopher in your list of useful roles to play in the world today. You've just said some very fine things about why that may be the case, but of course it's often overlooked or even excluded as being locked in texts and principles with no bearing on the real world. So it's lovely to have somebody who recognizes the importance of thinking. And let me tell you something about transforming knowledge as a project so that I can bring you a little bit into the thinking rather than just sort of pronounce the conclusions such as they are. I rarely manage to stick with the conclusion for very long. Way back then and before, actually, because I wrote the book when I had finally become clear about some things. I didn't write the book and then go out and talk to people. I talked to people and then I wrote the book. I learned from the work I did with people on trying to transform knowledge. That was my philosophical field work. So I said I didn't get a theory and then write about it, other way around. We had encountered, many of us, around that time, and of course other people had earlier in history, but we had encountered again the realization that you can't just add women in all our diversity and the excluded and devalued, exploited groups of men and other gendered groups, of course. You can't just add us to knowledge that has been premised on our exclusion. It's not just a mistake that we don't show up in histories. It's built into the meaning of history itself. So let me again back up from that and say that what happened is, I'll make this a little personal in some ways. I came to at some point, having already earned a PhD in teaching and doing some administration and so forth. I came to and realized, because people were raising feminist questions and civil rights questions, that I had spent my whole education and never noticed that the great books were written by men, that the men were of particular groups for the most part, that most of the professors, the great artists, the great, any category, leaders, were male. The point here is not that they were male. The point is I hadn't noticed that. And as I've always said, you know, in a world obsessed with gender, where it used to be the case anyhow, that the minute you were born, they put an armband on you that was, you know, like pink or blue to say which you were and were supposed to remain for your whole life. In a world that obsessed with gender, not to notice when a group is all male was stunning to me. I realized that if I saw a picture of all women in white coats standing around, I might say that's a room full of women doctors. If I saw a room full of men in white coats standing around, I would say that's a room of doctors. This realization that I wasn't noticing something so potent in the world was an extraordinary wake-up call. And bit by bit, as I talked to people about the realization, what unfolded after that is, having once realized that women in groups of men, devalued groups of men, other groups of people of various kinds, odd notion kinds, but let me leave that there for a moment. You can't just add us to the men who are there. You can't just say, okay, now we're going to add the excluded. Because, for example, if history is about presidents, generals, public figures, you can't just add people who were excluded from those offices. you end up with exceptions that prove the rule. The realization there is that there are formative notions within every mode of knowing, within every culture, with every meaning system. We're human. We are meaning-making creatures, meaning-created and meaning-creative creatures. So there are meanings within all of these frameworks, and insofar as they have been faultily put together, they're going to go on being faulty, and you can't correct them by just tacking something on. I don't want to go on about this forever, but what I want to do is to underscore that what I will now say, found was that change cannot be just additive, not if it's significant. It can be additive if it's insignificant. It can be slight alteration if it's just an adjustment of some kind. But if what you've encountered is formative of a whole culture's meaning systems, and therefore also how its institutions run, that's not just conceptual. Its notions of justice, its law codes, they're coherent with each other, more or less coherent with each other. If you've encountered a problem on that level, such as the exclusion of the majority of humankind from defining positions, meanings, power, or in our case now, if we have defined nature as created for, as it used to be said, man's use, and proceeded to use and abuse it to the point of destruction, if we encounter something on that level, we can't make change by just adding, adjusting, because it's what has gone wrong is on the level of the normative, like me not even seeing that all the so-called great figures were males, white males, and as we used to say at one point, dead white males. Used to be that when I said white males, everybody got very angry, incidentally. It's hard to believe that now. The first time I said that the male philosopher, Immanuel Kant, people got all upset. And then when we added white, they got even more upset. We added dead, they got really upset. Now we just say these things. This is cutting back on categories. This is saying this is not the normative kind, the only kind of human being. If you've encountered a problem on that level of definition so that knowledge is shaped around it, institutions are formed around it, you can't just add. You have to get down to the deforming roots, because otherwise, no matter what you do, it will get spewed out again. It won't stick, it won't last, it will get distorted. Because the normative is what people aren't even seeing. The old, deep, I'm going to say errors, they range from prejudices to just rampant mistakings of reality that are built in because of age-old prejudices and misjudgments, make it the case by now that you can be a wonderful person, you can be as good as you want to be, and be a part of a system that's doing harm. Because it's just the way things are, we may not even notice it. We don't usually notice it. When we notice it, belatedly in many of these cases, of course, because they've gone on for a long time, then we have to get going with transformation. And from my work, what I would say, the reason I talked about it as fieldwork philosophizing is because I have found that I can't change systems if I don't first work with people, including myself, obviously. It's one of the reasons for talking with lots of people in lots of situations. If I don't find what in the way I think is locking that system in, and by think I mean make meaning, make sense of the world. Otherwise, the world replicates itself through us. The world we have made, the human world, not the earth, the human world that we've made, replicates itself through us, is enshrined in knowledge and institutions. So I start now. I came to it when I was doing transforming knowledge as a process. Then I came to it from other directions. So now I start with the notion that we had better find out what we mean together, bring it out, look at it, expose it to the light, and actually often when we do that, it turns out not to be all that hard to change. And then you
so I know from working with you on our book that you're very thoughtful about covers. Tell us about this cover.
well, that's the Great Sphinx, of course. And part of what fascinates, there's a poem by Muriel Rukeyser, which is in the book, and I won't try and read it to you now, but it basically is the one about Oedipus, old and lame, comes upon, he has, what is he? Oedipus, old and lame, smells a curious smell. It's the Sphinx. He goes to the Sphinx and he says, let's see, you asked me a riddle, what goes on 4 legs in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening? And I answered correctly. I said, man. And you punished me anyhow. And she says, you didn't say anything about women.
Excellent.
Well, this is the Sphinx who thinks the Sphinx, everyone thinks the Sphinx knows, but they give the wrong answers to her riddles.
Very nice. I want to pick up on this. You're talking about the roots, because we had an exchange ahead of time. You're talking about getting at the roots, and you said, one of the things that drives all my work is the observation and concern that we try to fix fundamental problems with add-on remedies, as you were just saying, which is how I arrived at transforming knowledge. To my mind, to deal with fundamental problems or problems kept alive, even flourishing, despite repeated realizations that they are serious unto deadly, we have to discern, make visible, clarify, and dissolve their deepest conceptual roots, a rich sense of conceptual, enlaced with emotion, imagination, memory, infusing daily language. And you shared, I'm going to ask you if you will, share with the group your story of the sycamore tree.
I think it's sycamore. I meant to look it up. I once had a tree in my backyard that was driving me crazy, as occasionally trees can. I don't love all trees equally, although I should. This one was driving me crazy. So back in those days, I just cut it down. And lo and behold, what happened is that from its extensive root system, which is fairly close to the system, to the surface, all kinds of little shoots came up all over my yard. And I had like 25 sycamore trees growing, where before I had 1. Every time I cut one, like 3, 4 others would come up in other parts of the yard, which is exactly what happens with these notions that are deeply rooted in our culture. And our thinking of nature, for example, is something that is supposed to be in the service of, used to be man.
Yeah. We see this with terrorist groups as they spring around the world, you know, and with all kinds of things that we get at the surface of. You had one other metaphor that is very powerful, is in thinking about the way in which we go at the surface of something and it may not quite turn out the way we want to, and that is the sorcerer's apprentice. And I found that so powerful that I'm actually going to pull it up for people, Elizabeth, and for you. We're going to watch 2 minutes here, if I can make this work.
Michael, I think you're sharing the PowerPoint instead of the video screen.
So you're not seeing this?
No, we see your PowerPoint.
Oh, all
Hear
right.
it.
You have to share a different screen. Sorry for interrupting.
No, I appreciate that. It misses the whole point if you're not seeing it. All right. What I can do here. We may. So you're not seeing that.
No, it may be for you to end the screen share and then start it again with your video screen instead of the PowerPoint screen.
All right, let me try that. Otherwise, we'll give up on this. So I now will share again. Such a great piece. And Elizabeth, perhaps while I'm doing this, you could set up the piece. What's going on with Mickey? How he became the sorcerer's apprentice and what he's trying to do.
I don't remember all of the details, but the sorcerer's apprentice is obviously learning as much as he possibly can from the great sorcerer. And like most students, also likes to do whatever he wants to do when the teacher is away. At one point, the great sorcerer goes away and the apprentice sorcerer decides that he's going to use his new skills to do his chores. This may be his chores. Are we getting there?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And so Mickey has
water at this point, or brooms.
Yes, Mickey has learned the secret of the sorcerer to make the broom work on its own, sweep and carry water. And he's relaxing and the broom is doing all his work. And then it gets a little out of control. So Elizabeth, would you care to comment on what we just saw and its deeper philosophical meaning?
The line that keeps coming to mind at the moment is John Dewey's, what was the solution can become the problem. And he actually means that any solution, because if you change the circumstances now change and your solution is part of the context and it's going to cause its own problems. But not in our immediate context, I think it's, if you just try to take care of one problem in its own terms. Here's this broom bringing too much water. So let's break up the broom, make it stop. Not going to work. There's something behind it. We don't have the magic. You need to go to another level. If it's that serious a problem, for just a little bit of water wouldn't be a problem. But you can count on the fact that if we're just going to proliferate problems, one of my analogies for that is that we do things like tacking ethics courses onto fields when we think come to realize that you can do harm doing expert practice within your field or from your field. We tack on an ethics course. It doesn't do anything about what it is in the field that allows us, even trains us to do some things that are harmful. So this is all about not finding a quick fix, not just solving what looks like the immediate problem, getting down to the roots of it and getting to a different level of thinking. Not necessarily brand new. In this case, the sorcerer knows the magic and can do it.
My partner saw my pulling this up, and I told her what I was going to use with it, and she didn't know the background that you were going to present about seeing the male and female world, and she said, "You realize that Mickey's actions are those of a male."
Trying to get rid of sweeping up.
Right.
Like
every aspect of it. The shopping, the trying to get somebody else to do the work.
Right.
There are layers of meaning there.
Well, that's part of
well,
what
another
we
thing
about all of this. When you come on one of the most basic problems, its meanings are normalized across all dimensions. It's really stunning. That's one of the indications that we've got one of the core mistakings of our worlds that's causing enormous harm. The more places you find it, the more you ought to say, we're onto something here.
So is my slide screen back on?
I see interconnection.
Good. All right. Then that's the next thing we were going to talk about is how these things are interrelated and the difficulty, in part, the way you describe transformation, both conceptually, how we think about things, how we see the world, is connected with all the different systems, economic, political, social, cultural. And your work that's been a regular thread. It's certainly a thread of the Blue Marble work. So say a bit about how you've come at that from your work around transformation.
The notion of interconnection specifically?
Yes, right.
When we realized, I have to say we, because of course this is my work, but I did it. I have parts of it. It's a very large number of people and a great deal of conversation, and we all learned together. What we were looking for, or what sometimes we didn't even know we were looking for, what we were finding was that there were similarities across all disciplines concerning the ways that the old constructions of knowledge that grew out of culture systems that privileged a very few as the defining norm, the inclusive term, the ideal. There was man, universal man. So we used singular and he and man, and in fact, it only represented a few while claiming to be universal. So all consequent systems of explanation and understanding were in fact simply erroneous. That's called faulty generalization. You went too far from too few. It's actually very simple once you've seen it. But what we then, I don't even know whether to say we or I want to be inclusive, but I also don't want to put things on people that maybe they don't want me to. So I'll say I. It began to realize, as I said, across all disciplines, as well as different realms, the same errors were in play. That I didn't have to correct, and add on to the content of a field. I had to get down, with the help of people who knew the field, needless to say, had to get down to the root definitions, meanings, logics, rhetorics, techniques, methods, methodologies, had to get down to the root defining aspects of fields, institutions, meaning systems, whatever it could be an organization, get down to its founding principles. You had to get down to that level and find out where the fundamental errors that were everywhere were skewing that also. Always in particular mode for that field. History isn't going to have the same content to the errors, but it's going to have the same kind of errors. It's going to generalize too far from too few. It's going to define as the norm what is actually a very small group. It's going to define as the ideal that same small group, which is weird because then you're both the norm and an ideal. And when you start, those are in the book, those are the basic conceptual errors. When you have those in place, you end up with partial knowledge that's claiming to be knowledge. It's partial in both senses of the term. So the interconnections are not in the immediate manifestations like my sycamore or locust, maybe it was locust trees. I'll have to look that up, sorry. Anyhow, not in my trees that replicated themselves all over the place. What came up often initially looks quite different. But if you go beneath, what you find is very similar things, real skews in the way people are understanding things that is enabling, and then in circular fashion being enabled by those very basic errors. And any change.
And that's getting.
That takes you to
that's getting it. Yeah, and that's some of those roots that we were talking about earlier. You're getting down into the roots of a field, and you've talked about thinking within our fields, but not about our fields, which is what you've just been describing. But make that explicit. What's the difference between thinking within our fields, but not about our fields? And the context for this, for evaluators, is that we've been placing a lot of emphasis, as you know, and it's in the thinking book that we did together, we're going to turn to here in a moment. And I do want to invite people to make comments or put questions in the chat box if you want to. We'll get to a few of those and take the others into consideration, post them on our website, and have people get a chance to respond to them. So the chat box is available. But in evaluation, we placed a lot of emphasis on evaluative thinking. And it struck me that in terms of what you're talking about, we're doing a lot of thinking within our field, but we're not necessarily doing so much thinking about our field. What are you getting at with this distinction?
Well, if I stick with one of the early and important distinctions within evaluation, as I experienced it many years ago as part of a project that was being evaluated and that you have mentioned recently, very early on, a woman came out to evaluate one of our projects, and she said, well, there's summative evaluation. Basically, we wait until you're finished, and then we tell you where you mucked up. She said, now we can do formative evaluation, and I will come more often, and we'll do it along the ways, and that will help you adjust and do better, hopefully, as you proceed. That's the way I understood it. I claim no expertise here. I thought that was quite brilliant, that if you, that's a thinking about your field. Here we are trying to be useful to people with evaluation, and we only give them their feedback when it's too late to do anything about it, at least in that project. That's taking yourself outside, looking at effects, consequences, contexts, and watching what it is about the thinking inside and the way it's carried out that allows you then to change it. Infinitely more dramatic, that has to do with the book that I did on the evil of banality, is of course Adolf Eichmann, who's called the engineer of the final solution, the Holocaust, who under Hitler was basically responsible for transporting millions of people such that they could be murdered. It's a big logistics job to move millions of people to some place so that they can be murdered. This is the genocidal project, and it's actually quite complicated. It requires many, many people, amongst them people who can do the logistics. Eichmann did a pretty good job of that. And if you go through the training in his field, he was doing a good job as he was trained to do it. He was a good engineer of that sort. This is, one wants to say, troubling. Surely we want to say there are some things within every field that ought to have the reflective dimension that say, what is this for? Not just how. How is the how of what I'm doing itself harmful, perhaps even undercutting larger purposes of the field. Always bearing in mind, as we're acting within our field, following its logics and definitions, there is necessarily a great deal that we're leaving out devaluating, not taking into account, categorizing by our categories, maybe not anybody else's. And that means that we're in a narrow, particular way of thinking about the world. That is always going to be dangerous, as well as very useful when used appropriately. Precision is useful, accuracy is useful. Oh, excuse me, I should use another example there. My father, Andrew Kmark, who was an economist, development economist, one of the lines he used quite often was that you can be so precise as to be inaccurate, because the world itself is not very often precise. So he says we often confuse precision and accuracy. That's a very good example of noticing something about the way a field is working that looks good, and people get into it and they get more and more, say, mathematized, if you'll pardon that word, values at work, models and so forth, and they get further and further and further away from the messy, changing, plural, context, meaning, rich, contradictory, etc., human world. So I remember my father also talking about going to countries where they were supposed to do economic development and coming up with wonderful plans about, for example, you could drain that swamp and you'd have all this arable land that hadn't been available, and all you needed was modern technology. They'd bring in the technology, they'd start draining the swamp, and people would start rebelling all over the region and turn on them, and they'd have to flee or hire an army to protect them because they were draining where the ancestors lived. And they had never asked. They had never heard. Now,
Which brings us to
religion. Mm-hmm.
Which brings us to the value issue, because transformation is a descriptive term of great scale and scope, but it's neutral itself about whether that transformation is good or bad. You just described a transformation that was bad from a particular perspective. The evidence is that the coral reef out along Australia is being transformed. And presumably that's not a positive kind of transformation. You and your husband, Sai Khan, did a book on the fox and the hen house, looking at how privatization threatens democracy, a form of transformation. And so talk a bit about how we get the evaluation is fundamentally with the word value in the middle of it. To make evaluations, we have to be value-based. Your transformational work around knowledge was explicitly values-based around inclusion. And so let's give a moment here before we take some questions, the role of making values explicit, as we gave a lot of thought to that and talked about it with each other in the thought work book that we did, subtitled Thinking, Action, and the Fate of the World, which certainly suggests some values. And you thought a lot about the value premises. What do your philosophical fieldwork direct you towards in how we think about and engage with values?
I have to say something a professor once said to me that I didn't understand at all the time. I thought it was ludicrous. I asked him a question and he said, "I can't answer that. I'm writing a book about it." And I thought, well, that's pretty much what I'm writing now. I'm trying to draw out the moral philosophizing that emerges from just the kinds of projects we've been talking about. And because, of course, because of the kind of tension that you just underscored, Michael, as you do so well, which is, yes, of course it can be neutral. And I don't myself, see, now I'm getting into territory where I'm writing, so I'll stumble even more. I don't actually go to values that I hold explicitly that look like usual values. I'm much more involved in questions of how is this being done? And of course, there are choices at every level. So there's something about values always. I actually had a professor who said that all of life is actually moral because choices in effect are always being made for and against things. And when that's happening, people are doing evaluations and they're coming down on one, not others. We can call them all those values. It's not false. Choice has to do with values. weighting something more than others. So I actually want to take it down into the very fine grains and say to just keep asking, how are we making sense of this? And what are the many ways of making sense of it? Do we have enough people here talking from their perspectives? Are we listening and learning to hear them and to think better ourselves as a result of listening to them? Are we becoming more richer, more nuanced, more complex, and simultaneously, when we finally get there, simpler, not simplistic, the opposite of simplistic, simpler, for having thought things through in context with others? That process, this is where I'll make my value statement, if that's what I should call it. That process is, to me, fundamentally moral. The process itself, the how, because what we're doing is treating each other, our actions, the world we're affecting, with respect, with interest, with openness, with attentiveness. We are much less likely in that mode to do harm to it. At the very least, we'll be in the do no harm or maybe less harm. The last line in Dewey's wonderful Democracy in Education is the essential moral interest. Oh no, excuse me. Interest in learning from all the contexts of life is the essential moral interest, which is basically what I was just saying. Interest, being between, interest, to be with, respectfully, openly. If we're living that way and relating that way, we are engaging in a kind of rich relationality that can realize what all the meanings of being human, much less likely to narrow, to do harm, to impose, to violate and do violence. So I think there's a moral orientation that emerges with doing this work as attentively and always thoughtfully about, not just within, as possible.
And that says very well what our work around this book was: thought work, helping people think. And you stated it very eloquently, that thinking with people, thinking deeply, is itself a value. The subtitle, Thinking, Action, and the Fate of the World. And where we began the webinar was the difficulty people have in thinking at this particular moment. I had the opportunity in October of last year to be part of a celebration at the Centers for Disease Control of the 20th anniversary of their evaluation unit. And in the context of our times, this was last October, I'm going to show a slide that was the focus of my keynote address at that conference, and it was this. I suggested that the CDC should declare a national emergency to combat the incapacity to think pandemic in the world. That cluelessness is a major public health threat, and that we needed to be teaching thinking, weighing of evidence, and drawing conclusions as a public health concern.
Love it.
And so we come full circle to where we are in these days. Glenn or Charmaine, do you have a comment or question or two that you would bring forward to us?
Yeah, I'm gonna take this because Glenn's internet is spotty. So I think there's a lot of appreciation for the framing, but also some desire to get at a little bit more of the how. And so Christina asked specifically in the international development field, because of there's a lot of good intentions, but a lot of political dynamics where those with power still rule, and how do we organize against that when, you know, not everyone has the courage or has the ability to do that. So really, in short, kind of how does that transformation, what can you say a little bit more about how the transformation can occur?
Let me introduce Elizabeth to comment on the topic in two ways. One is one of the chapters in the book, Thought Work, is about that very topic from the point of view of a community organizer, Sai Khan, who is Elizabeth's husband. And so in that household, they have both the community organizer and the philosophical field worker working together. So your thoughts drawing from both of those traditions, Elizabeth?
Well, if we start from community organizing, there's, of course, I mean, I'll speak for him, you know, one of those things I rarely do. We don't do that, but here we are. One of the premises, is, of course, goes with actually one of the distinctions I made in The Evil of Banality between extensive and intensive, both evil and good, which is to say, if there's extensive evil, meaning great harm going on, as in some developments, in some countries where people can't get close to power to do anything about the development and are being, sometimes get badly hurt. Sometimes the development is off on the side and isn't related directly to that power, but then it gets perverted, so forth. If you've got that kind of a situation that has been normalized, it's very much a part of the whole power structure. It's what I would call an extensive evil. It depends on a great many people, in fact, to happen. We can pull out one figure or one group or one junta or one sort of location of power. But if you are in fact doing harm, let's just go ahead and say that for shorthand for the moment, if you are in fact doing harm to a country, to a culture, to an economy, to maybe a whole group within that, maybe even almost genocidal, maybe genocidal, if you're doing that kind of harm, you are depending on a great many people. You can't do it. You can't do harm across a whole country, a whole economy for years if people aren't, in fact, being part of that, one way or another, from being silent to actually doing the work of it, to just being obedient and, you know, doing what they feel they have to do. So at that point, amongst other things, one of the key points is for people to begin to realize that when they are together, they actually have enormous power, because none of this could happen without them. If you had a dictator and nobody did what the dictator said, the dictator would be powerless. Armies have been known not to do what they're ordered to do. The people in the military and the police have to choose, in fact, to pick up their weapons. They're not machines yet. They could be actually tomorrow, but never mind for the moment. So it's very important indeed that people get together however they can. This is why dictators always try and keep people separate. They do everything to break it down. Talking with people, any group that brings people together, finding out where it is that they do feel the problem, where they have some purchase on it, and beginning to build trust and networks and plans, and then taking on something small that you can win at, not the whole thing at once, something small, so you learn how to win, and building on that, you can transform a system by coming from, in effect, it's not, I don't like calling it the bottom, by having the great numbers of people transform together in communication. The hardest part about that is that dictators and others who are being corrupt know how to keep us apart from each other. But we can come together. And in doing that, as Sai wrote in our book, Michael, he was emphasizing how when we try and come together to exercise our power that we do have when we come together, one of the things that happens, of course, is that we bring some of the old errors with us, and we ourselves can be racist or sexist or blind to nature, which is where the Blue Marble evaluation can be so important. We have to learn how to think globally, or we will, even though we've come together and are trying to change things, we'll leave out crucial considerations too. So we always have to be thinking about what we're doing, and we have to be doing it with other people, and we have to be learning how much we can do when we do it together.
And the part I would emphasize out of that is a major feature of what we dealt with in a number of chapters in the book is that thinking is a form of action. Mm-hmm. One of the dichotomies in the world is separating thinking from action. And we make the point throughout, and a point throughout Elizabeth's work and through the Blue Marble evaluation book, and through evaluative thinking itself, is that thinking isn't a precursor to action. It is a form of action. Thinking together, getting people together, thinking deeply, considering evidence, these are actions. And we want to see those connected. The beginning point of dealing, as you've said, with oppression is to get people to think and to think together. Got time for maybe one or two more? Charmaine, do you have another one you'd pull up?
Yeah, there's a couple that touch on sort of what are we looking for, you know, from an evaluation perspective. You've talked about interocular significance where you know it when you see it, but are there things to look for along the way that can point that we might be heading in the right direction when we're trying to look for transformational change? And especially in this time of great uncertainty, there's so many uncertainties about the future, like what can we start doing now and looking for to move us in the right direction?
So one of the things that we'll be discussing in a future chapter, chapters 13 and 14 of the book, take up what I've called the transformation fidelity principle. And that is part of evaluation as reality testing, is to look at whether what people are calling transformation is actually transformation. And Elizabeth's book on transforming knowledge and the work that we did in the thought workbook takes that term very seriously. I'm on a Google alert for the word transformation. About 95% of what comes across are people changing their wardrobes, changing their hair colors, remodeling their kitchens, changing their branding, putting in computers, digitalization, but they're not doing the kind of deep-rooted transformation that Elizabeth has talked about, changing systems. And so one role for evaluation is to treat this seriously, think about what transformation means, the scale, the scope of it, and to then within any given context, as we always do, what are going to be the things to look for that point out a transformational trajectory. Let's take one more quickly and then we'll close off, Charmaine.
So there's a question about, is the transformation we're referring to synonymous with policy transformation? If so, is there a default preference for incremental versus momentous pace change in all instances? And what about differing transformational policy levels, changes, results, principles, settings, and different paths of progression?
Let me answer from the Blue Marble perspective. Another one of the principles we're looking at, the local principle, the global local interaction that has to do with the interconnections that Elizabeth and I were talking about. Is it's not for transformation to occur, it doesn't occur in any one arena. It's not just at the top level policy, it's got to be at the bottom level where people are working and thinking together. It's got to be across sectors, regulatory, education, incentives, economic, institutional. And so when we look at the major transformations of the past, the end of colonialism, the end of apartheid, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the pushback of the AIDS epidemic, very relevant now, work around transforming knowledge that Elizabeth has been involved in. These are multifaceted, multi-sectoral kinds of initiatives. So we'll look at and post the other chat questions on the website. I want to note that our next book club webinar is going to be on chapter 4 of the integration principle on April 27th. And we have several additional webinars that you'll find on the Blue Marble website that look at various transformational issues. I thank Elizabeth very much. I've certainly enjoyed this and appreciate your being a part of this, Elizabeth. And we're going to send everybody out with a little emphasis on thinking from the mother of soul, thinking of her as Mother Earth. And this is the message we want to leave with you today. Sing along if you're inclined.
Be more likely to dance, actually.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth. Stay healthy, stay sane, stay well, stay strong, and we'll get together again in April. Thank you very much, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Michael, and all of you that I didn't get to see.
Goodbye.